Talking to Strangers, What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know, by Malcolm Gladwell. Introduction. On a hot July afternoon in 2015, a young woman named Sandra Bland was driving her silver Hyundai through the flat, open countryside of Prairie View, Texas. She had just moved from Chicago to start a new job at her old university. It was a moment of hope, a fresh start. As she drove along a quiet road bordering the campus, she saw a police car speeding up behind her. She did what any of us would do: she moved over to let him pass. But he didn't pass. Instead, his lights flashed. The officer, a state trooper named Brian Encinia, walked up to her window. He was polite, at first. "The reason for your stop," he said, "is because you failed to signal the lane change." Sandra Bland was irritated. She had moved over for him. "I was getting out of your way," she told him. "You were speeding up, tailing me, so I move over and you stop me." A moment of tension. An ordinary moment that happens thousands of times a day across the country. But what happened next was anything but ordinary. Sandra Bland lit a cigarette to calm her nerves. And the officer said, "You mind putting out your cigarette, please?" "I'm in my car," she replied. "Why do I have to put out my cigarette?" The officer's tone changed. "Well, you can step on out now." "I don't have to step out of my car." "Step out of the car," he demanded, his voice rising. That simple traffic stop for a minor infraction spiraled, in just a few minutes, into a shouting match, an arrest, and a tragedy. 3 days later, Sandra Bland was found dead in her jail cell. The video of their encounter was viewed millions of times. The country erupted in debate. How could something so small go so horribly wrong? This question is the heartbeat of a remarkable book by one of the greatest storytellers of our time, Malcolm Gladwell. In Talking to Strangers, Gladwell takes us on a journey to understand what happened on that Texas roadside. And what he reveals is that the tragedy of Sandra Bland isn't just a story about one officer and one driver. It's a story about a fundamental misunderstanding we all share. A set of mistakes we make every time we try to make sense of a person we don't know. By the end of our time together today, you will understand the 3 hidden rules that govern our interactions with strangers. You'll see why the world's most sophisticated intelligence agency can be fooled by spies, why a brilliant investor was able to run the largest fraud in history in plain sight, and why the innocent can sometimes look guilty. More importantly, you'll learn how to navigate your own world with a little more wisdom, a little more caution, and a great deal more humility. Because the tools we use to understand each other are broken. And it's time we learned why. Book summary. Imagine you are one of the most senior intelligence officers at the CIA. Your entire career is built on one skill: judging people. You recruit spies, evaluate their loyalty, and use their information to protect your country. You are, by definition, an expert on strangers. Now, imagine a man walks into the U.S. Embassy in Vienna. His name is Florentino Espaga, and he's a high-ranking officer in Cuba's spy service. He's a defector, a walk-in, and he has a story to tell. He sits down with your team and delivers a bombshell. He starts naming the spies the CIA has been running inside Cuba. That agent you recruited on a ship in Antwerp? He's a double agent, secretly working for Cuba. That guy with a limp in the defense ministry? He's a double too. One by one, he goes down the list until he has named nearly every single asset the United States has on the island. They were all fake. For years, the Cuban government had been feeding the CIA carefully crafted misinformation, and the CIA had believed every word. The most sophisticated intelligence service in the world had been played for a fool. This incredible story opens the first great puzzle of Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers. Why are we so bad at spotting a liar, even when it's our job? The answer, Gladwell explains, comes from the work of a psychologist named Tim Levine. Levine argues that as human beings, our brains operate with a simple, powerful, and deeply necessary bias. He calls it the default to truth. Our operating assumption, in any conversation, is that the person we are talking to is being honest. Think about it. When you buy a coffee, you don't question if the barista is telling you the truth about the price. When you ask for directions, you don't assume the person is trying to mislead you. We default to truth because society cannot function otherwise. Imagine a world where every interaction began with suspicion. It would be paralyzed by mistrust. Communication would be impossible. Defaulting to truth is a feature, not a bug. But it has a downside. It makes us vulnerable. The Cuban spies weren't brilliant actors, they were just talking to people who were wired to believe them. The CIA officers weren't incompetent, they were human. We only stop believing someone when the doubts and red flags pile up so high that we can no longer explain them away. Our instinct isn't to start with skepticism, it's to start with trust. Perhaps no story illustrates this better than the case of Bernie Madoff, the man who orchestrated the largest Ponzi scheme in history. For decades, Madoff produced impossibly steady investment returns, defying all laws of finance. People all over Wall Street had their suspicions. They'd look at his numbers and say, "This doesn't add up." One hedge fund, Renaissance Technologies, even conducted an internal investigation and concluded they had no idea how he was making his money. So did they pull all their money out? No. They cut their investment in half. They had doubts, but they didn't have enough doubts. They defaulted to truth. After all, this was Bernie Madoff, a former chairman of the Nasdaq, a pillar of the financial community. He was surrounded by regulators and auditors. Surely, if he were a complete fraud, someone would have caught him. They assumed the system worked, and that the person in front of them was, more or less, who he said he was. But there was one man who didn't default to truth. His name was Harry Markopolos, a little-known financial investigator from Boston. When he looked at Madoff's numbers in the late 1990s, he didn't just have doubts, he went immediately to disbelief. "It's a Ponzi scheme," he told everyone who would listen. For a decade, he wrote letters to the regulators at the SEC, begging them to investigate. He created charts, ran models, and gift-wrapped the evidence. No one listened. Markopolos was what Gladwell calls a holy fool, the outcast who sees the truth that everyone else misses. But what made him see the truth? It was his starting point. He didn't trust anyone. He grew up seeing theft in his family's restaurants. He saw fraud everywhere. He assumed the world was crooked. And in the case of Madoff, that worldview made him a hero. But Gladwell asks a crucial question: can we all be Harry Markopolos? The answer is no. A world full of Markopoloses would be a world of crippling paranoia. He was so convinced that Madoff's cronies were coming after him that he started carrying a gun, checked under his car for bombs, and lived in constant fear. His lack of trust allowed him to spot a con man, but it also isolated him. The trade-off for being vulnerable to the occasional Madoff is a world where we can have efficient communication and social coordination. As Gladwell puts it, defaulting to truth is a good deal. Most of the time, it serves us well. But on those rare, tragic occasions when it fails spectacularly. This is the shadow that hangs over the devastating story of Jerry Sandusky, the beloved Penn State football coach who is revealed to be a serial child abuser. For years, there were whispers and reports about Sandusky. A young coach named Mike McQueary walked into a locker room late one night and saw Sandusky in the shower with a young boy. He was shaken, and he told his boss, the legendary coach Joe Paterno. But what did Paterno and the university administration do? They didn't call the police immediately. The reports they received were murky, second-hand. The story was described as horseplay. Sandusky was a celebrated figure, a man who had founded a charity for troubled youth, who was surrounded by children his entire life. To believe he was a monster was to believe something almost unimaginable. So, they defaulted to the most innocent explanation. They defaulted to truth. Their failure to see the monster in their midst wasn't a simple act of conspiracy or a cover-up. It was a failure born of a deeply human instinct. They had doubts, but like Madoff's investors, they didn't have enough doubts to overcome their fundamental assumption that the world, and the people in it, are basically good. The tragedy of the Sandusky case is a heartbreaking reminder of the price we sometimes pay for that trust. So our first problem with strangers is that we are wired to believe them. But there's a second, even deeper problem. Even when we are suspicious, we think we can spot a liar by looking closely at their face and their body language. We believe in what Gladwell calls the illusion of transparency. Think about the TV show Friends. When Ross is angry, his brow furrows, his jaw drops, and his eyes squint. When Monica is happy but also a little sad, she raises her eyebrows and gives a half smile. The actors make sure that every emotion their character feels on the inside is perfectly expressed on the outside. Their behavior is a reliable window into their soul. We believe real life works the same way. We believe that liars fidget and avoid eye contact, and that honest people are calm and look you straight in the eye. We believe that what we see on the outside is a true reflection of what's happening on the inside. But, as Gladwell powerfully demonstrates, this is a myth. The most famous, and infamous, example of this is the case of Amanda Knox. She was an American student studying abroad in Italy when her roommate, Meredith Kirker, was brutally murdered. The police brought Knox in for questioning, and from the very beginning, they were suspicious of her. Why? Because of her demeanor. At the police station, while other friends of Meredith were weeping in corners, Knox was seen kissing her boyfriend and doing cartwheels. When she was brought to the crime scene, she put on the protective booties, swiveled her hips, and said, "Ta-da." The investigators saw this behavior and thought, this is not how a grieving, innocent person acts. She must be a cold, calculating killer. The media dubbed her Foxy Knoxy, and she was convicted of murder. She spent 4 years in an Italian prison before she was finally, completely exonerated. Amanda Knox's problem was that she was mismatched. She was an innocent person who acted guilty. She was quirky, awkward, and emotionally unconventional. In a moment of trauma and confusion, she didn't behave the way we expect people to behave. And for that, the system judged her. The lead investigator even said they established her guilt by closely observing the suspect's psychological and behavioral reaction. They didn't need evidence, they thought they could read her mind just by looking at her. The illusion of transparency works both ways. We misjudge the innocent who look guilty, and we are fooled by the guilty who look innocent. Bernie Madoff came across as a calm, confident, trustworthy man, the demeanor of an honest person. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, flew to Germany to meet Adolf Hitler before World War II. He wanted to look him in the eye, to take his measure. Hitler greeted him with a warm, double-handed handshake, and Chamberlain came away convinced that here was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word. Hitler was a liar who had the demeanor of an honest man. He was mismatched. Gladwell shows us that the idea that our faces are universal billboards for our emotions is just not true. He takes us to the Trobriand Islands, a remote archipelago near Papua New Guinea, where researchers showed the islanders photos of classic Western facial expressions. A scowling face, which we see as anger, they saw as happiness or sadness. A wide-eyed, gasping face, which we see as fear, they interpreted as a threatening gesture. Even within our own culture, transparency is a fiction. In one German experiment, psychologists created a truly surprising event for participants and found that only 5% of them made the classic surprised face with wide eyes and a dropped jaw. Most people showed no expression at all. We think we can read strangers, but we can't. This brings us back to another puzzle from the book's opening. In New York City, a team of researchers built a computer algorithm to predict which defendants let out on bail would commit another crime. They fed the computer basic information: the defendant's age and criminal record. Then they compared the computer's predictions to the decisions made by human judges, who had all that information plus the ability to see the defendant in person, to look them in the eye and observe their demeanor. The result? The computer was 25% better at predicting who would re-offend. The extra information the judges got from meeting the stranger didn't help them. It hurt them. It introduced bias and noise. They were being fooled by the illusion of transparency, sending people to jail because they didn't look right, and letting others go free because they seemed trustworthy. So we default to truth, and we believe in transparency. We start with trust, and we judge with our eyes. And both of these tools are deeply flawed. But there is a third and final mistake we make, one that ties everything together. We fail to understand the importance of context. We believe that a person's behavior is a reflection of their essential character. But Gladwell argues that behavior is often powerfully linked to a specific time and place. He calls this idea coupling. The most haunting example of this is the story of the poet Sylvia Plath. Plath took her own life in the winter of 1963 by putting her head in a gas oven. Her suicide has become a part of her legend, the story of a doomed, brilliant artist, obsessed with death. Her end felt inevitable. But Gladwell asks us to look closer, not at Plath, but at her world. In the mid-20th century, most homes in Britain were heated by town gas, a form of gas manufactured from coal that contained a high concentration of deadly carbon monoxide. Sticking your head in a gas oven was, at the time, the leading method of suicide in the country. It was easy, painless, and readily available. Then, starting in the late 1960s, Britain began a massive project to switch from town gas to natural gas, which contains no carbon monoxide. The conversion took a decade. And what happened to the suicide rate? It plummeted. The people who would have used their ovens didn't just switch to another method. For the most part, they just didn't kill themselves at all. Sylvia Plath's suicide wasn't simply the act of a depressed person. It was the act of a depressed person at a particular moment of extreme vulnerability, coupled with a particular, readily available lethal means. Had she been born 10 years later, in a house with a natural gas stove, she might have lived. Her behavior was coupled to her context. We see this principle everywhere. Criminologist David Weisberg discovered what he calls the law of crime concentration. He found that crime isn't spread evenly across bad neighborhoods. It's concentrated in tiny hotspots, a few specific street corners or blocks that account for the majority of a city's crime. Criminal behavior, too, is coupled to place. This insight led to a revolution in policing, born from a famous experiment in Kansas City. In the early 1990s, police were feeling hopeless against a rising tide of violence. A previous experiment had shown that random police patrols did nothing to deter crime. So, a criminologist named Lawrence Sherman tried something new. He had officers flood the city's crime hotspots. And he told them to be proactive, to use any legal pretext, a broken taillight, a failure to signal, to stop cars and look for guns. The results were stunning. Gun crimes in those specific areas were cut in half. The lesson from Kansas City was that policing works when it is focused, when it understands context. But the rest of the country took away a different, simpler lesson. They heard proactive traffic stops and thought that was the magic bullet. Police departments all over America started dramatically increasing the number of traffic stops they made, not just in crime hotspots, but everywhere. They took a strategy that was designed for a very specific context and applied it universally. They ignored the power of coupling. And this brings us, finally, back to Sandra Bland. Let's look at that encounter on the side of the road through the lens of these three ideas. First, Brian Encinia was a product of this new era of policing. He was trained not to default to truth. His job was to be suspicious, to look for the needle in the haystack. On a typical day, he would write ticket after ticket for minor infractions, improper mudflaps, non-compliant headlamps. He was constantly on the hunt. His default was suspicion. Second, he was a firm believer in the illusion of transparency. When he saw Sandra Bland, he didn't see a woman who was new in town, starting a new life, understandably frustrated by being pulled over for what seemed like nothing. He saw her agitation, her aggressive body language, and he read it as the demeanor of a dangerous person. He thought she might have a weapon. She was mismatched, an upset person who, to his trained but misguided eye, looked like a criminal. And third, and most critically, he ignored context. The aggressive, proactive policing strategy he was using was designed for the violent, gun-ridden hotspots of Kansas City. But where was he? He was in Prairie View, Texas, on a quiet road next to a university campus. He was using a hotspot tactic in a cold spot. The entire context was wrong. The tragedy of Sandra Bland wasn't the result of one bad cop. It was the culmination of a series of mistakes, a perfect storm of flawed assumptions about strangers. We trained an officer to be suspicious, taught him to trust his flawed ability to read people's demeanor, and then sent him to use a powerful tactic in a place where it didn't belong. We do not know how to talk to strangers. And when things go wrong, as they did for Sandra Bland, we don't look at our broken tools. We blame the stranger. Commentary. So, what do we take away from this powerful, and at times unsettling, journey with Malcolm Gladwell? The lesson of talking to strangers is not that we should give up on trying to understand each other. It's a call for something far more profound: humility. The book asks us to accept that the project of knowing another person, especially a stranger, is fraught with difficulty. We are armed with flawed tools. We are wired to trust, which is a beautiful and necessary trait, but one that leaves us open to deception. We are convinced we can read a person's soul by looking at their face, but demeanor is often a poor guide to character. And we consistently underestimate the power of a person's situation, their context, in shaping their actions. What, then, should we do? First, we can be gentler with ourselves and others when our trust is violated. The parents of the gymnasts abused by Larry Nassar were not bad parents for believing a trusted doctor. Graham Spanier was not a criminal for failing to immediately assume the worst about Jerry Sandusky. Defaulting to truth is not a character flaw. It is the foundation of a functioning, open society. The moments where that trust fails are tragic, but a world without that default trust would be unlivable. Second, we must approach strangers with caution and recognize the limits of our knowledge. We will never have a perfect lie detector or a foolproof way to read a person's heart. That means we have to be content with something less than certainty. We can't know for sure if a defendant will re-offend, or if a political leader is telling the truth. We can only gather what evidence we can, and proceed with the humble awareness that we might be wrong. And finally, we must pay far more attention to the stranger's world. Before we rush to judge a person's character based on their actions, we should ask, where are they? What are the rules of that environment? What pressures are they facing? The sex workers in Jersey City weren't just prostitutes. They were mothers and daughters and friends, anchored to their community for the same reasons we all are. Sylvia Plath wasn't just a doomed poet. She was a woman living at a time and in a place that offered her a tragically easy escape. Context reveals a stranger's complexity. The death of Sandra Bland should haunt us, not because it was an isolated incident, but because the mistakes that led to it are ones we all make. We live in a world that is more connected and more complicated than ever before. We are constantly interacting with people whose backgrounds, assumptions, and cultures are different from our own. Getting it right, learning to talk to strangers with the care, humility, and wisdom they deserve, is the central challenge of our time. That was our deep dive into Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. We've explored the core ideas today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only take you so far. The real magic of a Gladwell book happens when you read it yourself. It's in the quiet moments when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is designed to give you a framework for the book's powerful ideas. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or resonated with you, I truly encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts, it's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see the world and the people in it. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable and want to continue exploring the ideas in some of the most influential books on the planet, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that this work is making a difference for you, and it ensures you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.